Who can you trust when reinventing yourself? I'm going to be debunking the myth of the richest man in Babylon. I'm also going to be answering the question why you have to be careful whom you trust when you're reinventing yourself. How's it going, Reinventors? I'm Amelia. This is Reinventing You. This is the channel where you can be inspired to take your own reinventing journey so that you can live a life of joy, fulfillment, and purpose. And once you're taking that journey, you become a reinventor. If this is your first time here, welcome. I post twice a week. If you have not subscribed, this is a great time to do that. If you have watched my videos before or are already a subscriber, please don't forget to like this video. This video is a little bit different from some of my other videos. It was not an idea that I had thought about for a long time. It just basically came up in the last couple of days, and I tried to figure out how to do a video about it because it seemed like kind of different. But then I thought about the issue of trust. And this has been like this in the year of this election, this presidential election, the, fact checkers and the trust. I mean, I'm talking about all sides. I'm just not one of the other parties. I'm just saying everybody has got, their facts have got to be checked. And so it just makes me more cautious when it comes to reinventing, when it comes to subject matters that I cover on this channel, and simply life in general. And at one point I was reading an article, I cannot remember who mentioned it. Cat and dog are going nuts today. Anyway, I cannot remember who mentioned it, but somebody suggested a book called The Richest Man in Babylon. I was like, well, that's kind of interesting. I think I'll check it out. So I basically did check it out. I went to my local library and I got a copy, and it's a real thin copy. And I thought, oh, good, it won't take me long. Put this down. I thought, oh, good, it won't take me long, 30 minutes maybe. But I want you to see this is the print on this book. And I'm sorry, this is the smallest print. Basically, when I tried to find like who published it and everything, I really couldn't find it. Basically, it looks like the typed up pages in a PDF that somebody just put together in a book. And I started reading it, and it was really interesting because he talks about George Clason talks about in the very beginning of the book about these clay tablets that were found in Babylon. It talks a little bit about Babylon, and I'm, a history minor in college, and so I was really interested in that. And my husband's into archaeology, and so I just started thinking about it. And then I read on the back about George Samuel Clayson, that he was born in 1874, and this book was actually published as a series of pamphlets in the mid-1920s. And so I just kind of, wow, that's really fascinating. It's been around a long time, and it's got this historical and archaeological significance. And I just happened to have a conversation with my husband about it because we usually share what we're reading with each other. And I said something about it, and I said, my thing about it is how did he get these translations of these tablets? I mean, I was thinking in terms of the language. And so we talked about the Rosetta Stone and everything. And when I told him about when it was published, he said, well, that's about right, because they did find those tablets in the 19th century and, began to discover more about them. And in fact, I think it was 1905, when they actually cracked the code and were able to read all of these tablets. But I started thinking about it more. And these are the questions that I started asking about. And my first one was, who translated these tablets? How trustworthy is the translation? And how did George S. Clason get these translations? They seem to be kind of his own thing. Who was George S. Clason? And I started with the book. So I also started Googling. So within 30 minutes of Googling, I realized George Clason made this up. Now, this does not mean that the advice he gives in these pamphlets in this book is bad advice. but the more you put the puzzle pieces together, the more it makes sense. So I'm going to break it down a little bit. And the first thing that I did is I read the back of the book, and the back of the book says he was born in Louisiana, Missouri, November 7th, 1874. He attended the University of Nebraska, and by the way, he would have attended that university within it had been around 20 years. It was a very young university. He was in the United States Army during the Spanish-American War. It says he was a successful businessman. He founded the Klassen Map Company of Denver, Colorado, and published the first road atlas of the United States in Canada. And then in 1926, he issued these pamphlets on his own financial success. They were actually picked up by banks. It was something the banks would hand out, these little pamphlets, and eventually he put them together and published them in one volume. So that tells you a little bit about George Samuel Klassen. I started looking into him, and it's true that the dates, he was a real person. He was a real person. That was the first thing that I found out, and I have my iPad here to prove everything. He was married twice. He actually had his first wife died in 1925, and he remarried in 1927. So he's buried in the Golden Gate National Cemetery in California. You can go see his grave there. So that was my first question about good old George. So I just started looking at some of his accomplishments. Okay, so he created this first atlas of the U.S. And the two things that I found really interesting about it was that the Klassen Map Company issued maps, state road maps, between 1923 and 1931. And I'm getting this information actually from the Michigan State University Library. And the problem is there are some challenges with establishing exactly what dates those were published. And of course, Klassen self-published these atlases. But unlike Rand McNally and Gusha, the Klassen Map Company technically did not place dates or date codes on its products during this period. So that was not a kosher thing to do. That's not really good. And a systematic review of the maps contained in these maps, the touring atlases and the green guides, revealed that the road legends and other map symbols varied over the years in systematic ways. In other words, he was not consistent in his maps, which for a map, that's not good. You have got to have the same kind of symbols and everything in your maps. If you don't match other maps, you've got to be consistent within your own maps, and apparently he was not. So this was not, even though he published his maps and they were available, I wouldn't say they were very well used. They were probably not very trustworthy. I'm not really sure. But I decided, okay, well, he published these maps. What else did he publish? Well, I could only find, besides The Richest Man in Babylon, I could only find one book he published in 1930. He published a book, and I couldn't find the title, but you can actually read the book. It is in the internet. You just put down Klassen Publishing and you come up with it. Basically, it's only a book that shows different kind of fonts over the ages, so it's not really a book. It doesn't really read anything. It's just like a series of different fonts from different kinds of published printed works from years. And so it was a very strange kind of thing. And we know that he did publish his pamphlets into a thing and talked about being financially successful. But I'm having my doubts. And the reason I'm having my doubts of his financial success, I started investigating these tablets, these clay tablets, as he claimed in his book. And he even has, at the very end, he has these supposed letters that came from a man who was an archaeologist and said he had sent him the translations of these tablets. Most of what we know about the Babylonian tablets probably are something you learned in high school. and we know it as the Epic, is that what it's called? The Epic of Gilgamesh. And what was so shocking, and this was in the mid-19th century, what was so shocking, they were translated and they realized they were another kind of telling of the flood story, which we read in the Bible. And everybody was sort of, people who of faith were taken aback that somebody else would have had a flood story. But I was like, okay, where did he get these tablets and everything? And the more I read about it, apparently the tablets that we have we have the story of Gilgamesh, we have recipes, we have medicine, we have some financial records, no stories, just financial records. We have stories about the kings. We have all of these things, but there's nothing about financial advice. There's records, financial records, but no financial advice. So I started to really doubt that these things existed. In addition, when I looked at the actual translations of all of these things, the way they are written is sort of in a poetic form. It's just very little statements. It's not like a storyline. It's just little here and there. And then his thing reads as a story with lots of these and thous. Obviously, to try to think it's old, kind of making it sound like Old English, which is not necessarily Old Babylonian, okay? Anyway, when I, was looking at all of these things and reading the story of Gilgamesh, I mean, there's just no way anybody in that time would be telling stories that didn't involve spiritual component, gods and goddesses, or king, or major war. I mean, it just is not going to happen. So that's sort of like, wait a minute, what's going on with that? And then I started thinking about it. When did he write these pamphlets? When did they come out? They came out around 1926. What was going on in 1926? Well, really, I didn't need to look this up because I remember the date of 1929. Anybody here remember 1929? Probably not, but we probably have heard that day before, and that was the crash, the economic crash, beginning of the Great Depression was 1929. So we're talking about 4 years before, the beginning of the Great Depression and the crash of the stock market. So there's something going on here. And I started, thinking about if you have a pamphlet that encourages, what he says in the book. I mean, he says he said the first thing he says is pay yourself first, and that's the first story, the lesson that you learn. That is, take 10% of what you earn and you set it aside. Now he goes on in the book to say you don't just put it in your pocket and walk away, but you actually invest it. Okay, it's 1925, the stock market is booming, you're going to a bank. The bank wants you to put your money in the bank. And if you could take 10% of your money and you put it in the bank, what does the bank do with it? Well, the bank doesn't leave it in the vault. The bank, and they do this today, by the way, is going to invest your money in the stock market. Of course, banks are going to want you to put your money. So yeah, they're going to want to have a pamphlet that encourages you to save money. But how are you going to encourage people to save money? Well, let's create a story that 5,000 years ago, the people of Babylon, they learned this story, and look what a great city they were and how well they did. And it was an amazing accomplishment. I mean, the city had a wall around it that was so wide you could have chariot races on the wall. I mean, that's how amazing this whole city was. And in fact, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon are one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. So there's something about Babylon that's very attractive. So what if you had a story about how people of Babylon learn how to save money and become wealthy and become the richest person in Babylon? So, all of this stuff really makes sense when you think about it. And one article that I found says the world's most popular money tip came from a map maker whose business got crushed by the Great Depression. So poor George, apparently he was telling people to pay yourself first, and he lost a lot of money in the stock market. And the crash in 1929, a lot of people lost a lot of things. Somehow his book has lived on. I'm not saying his advice is bad. What I'm saying is, before you, in your reinventing journey, start trusting somebody's advice, whether you know them or you hear them on YouTube or you read their book, look into more about what they're saying. I try to always, I try to do my best to leave links to where you can read about this. And all of the things I'm talking about, I'll have links below that you can check it out. But what I'm saying is, check this stuff out. Don't just take it at face value. We've gotten so used to that. We read everything. We think everything people post on Facebook is true, and it's not. I have spent more time this year fact checking. Of course, I've had a lot more time at my hands, but I'm just saying, don't trust everything you hear when it comes to reinventing yourself, when you're making major changes, when your life is, in the balance. Be careful, because look at George. I mean, he gave this advice, and sure, people are following it today, but was he really successful? He didn't do that much. After he published one book, he published some pamphlets, he may have made some money from banks, but a lot of banks closed after the crash. So my guess is he didn't do so well. I don't know, but I'm just thinking, here we have this person that a lot of financial gurus and advisors and everybody point to this book, and yet this is a made-up story. So we just have to be careful who we're following, what advice that we're getting. Just go and check. If you want to say, hey, pay myself first, take 10% off your income and put it aside, I think that's great. I know most Americans anyway don't save enough. It probably needs to be more like 20%. But think of, before you just immediately follow with advice, check it out. You have to be careful when you're reinventing yourself. So in the comments below, I want to know, have you ever followed somebody's advice and found out later that it was not good advice, or it was a person who gave good advice, but they did not live up to the advice? I want to hear about it. Let me know also if you have some ideas for future videos. Don't forget to subscribe, like this video if it was helpful for you, and have a great one.